Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Silver Years. My name is DK, and I'm very happy to be here, and I humbly thank you for joining me. Today is a new segment of My Story Time. My Story Time is where I tell my story as a way to counter the ever changing official narrative of history, his story. Because no one, not even AI, can tell my life story as a direct reflection of the times in which I lived better than me. And this is where I'm telling it. The story that will be told today is part three and a continuation from the two previous My Storytime posts titled Part One and Part Two. This is not a standalone video, and watching parts one and two is required viewing in order to understand this video and to not take things out of context or make incorrect assumptions, which is important. Links to part one and part two will be in the description box, and I'll include a link for part one above as well. That being said, this continuation takes place between around 1974 to 1975 in Huntington Beach, California, when I was a young teenager. As I mentioned in my previous videos, this is about how I met my first husband, how it came about, and how it came together. But there is a lot to unpack here, and it may require a part four. I'm not sure. I guess we'll see. I said this in the beginning, and I'll say it here again. I've realized that it's time to tell this old story as I experienced it and clear up any misunderstandings if they exist for those impacted. It is also time to give energetic closure to these old stories. Closure offers healing, and you need to reveal to heal. These are things I have rarely spoken about in 50 years, but for whatever the reason, I feel compelled to speak my truth now, as I experienced it, as best I can, warts and all. And by the way, me telling my story from my perspective is in no way meant to disparage or attack anyone. This was my experience, period. Sweeping it under the rug with silence serves no purpose anymore except to perpetuate generational trauma, and I can no longer be complicit in that. Take it or leave it. It matters not to me, and it changes nothing. If me telling this helps even one person, then that's a good thing. All right, I ended part two where little Beta was beginning to win me over by buying me things. Personal things that I didn't, for the first time in my life, have to share with my siblings. Things that were just for me. And rest assured, it didn't take much for me to appreciate it. Buying things may have opened a door, however, but it wasn't enough to win me over because I wasn't easily swayed or bought off through material things. Buying me material things was never an effective motivation for me, still isn't. For him, on the other hand, gifts that were given had strings attached. It was the unspoken way of his family, and they kept score. Now, I was about 15 years old when this was going on, and he was about 20 years old. So during this 1974 1975 time frame, little Beta began slowly replacing my family with his. And his family welcomed me with open arms. I slowly began spending time at their house, and for the first time in my short life, I was beginning to feel like there was something there for me, something I was sorely missing. Little Beta had a 1962 Volkswagen Beetle by this time. The Ranchero was gone since he was no longer racing motocross, and he had no need for a truck bed to haul his motorcycles in. This little white Volkswagen had an engine that looked like a go-kart motor. Even I could understand it. And yes, I even knew where the spark plugs were. but it was a manual stick transmission. It was a stick shift. And when I was close to 15 years old, he took me to the empty parking lot of the local junior college and taught me to drive that stick shift until I perfected it. He would even let me use his car on my own to go to school or just joyride with my girlfriends, even though I had no driver's license. I didn't even have a learner's permit until I was 15 and a half. When I turned 16, my mother refused to take me to the DMV to take the driving test so that I could get a driver's license because she wouldn't let me use her car for the test. She wouldn't take the time. So, guess who saved the day and made it happen? It was little Beta's family to the rescue. His sister let me use her car. I remember it was a white Mustang that had no power steering, which made performing that required 3-point turn maneuver. They don't have to do that anymore, but we did. Not having power steering made doing that maneuver very difficult. I did it anyway, but it was hard. It was an automatic transmission, however. Anyhow, she took me to the DMV and let me use her car for the test, which I passed, and I walked away with a driver's license. During this time, as little Beta was striving to make his transition from big brother to boyfriend and significant other, he would spend evenings simply talking with me in the garage as I was doing the laundry and the ironing. Usually it was just me alone in the garage as I did my chores. It was a quiet spot in the house where I could think. This is where the religious overlay came into play. I had during this time a highly disturbing experience with the local Catholic priest who'd come to our door looking for my mother early one Saturday morning. It was an experience I'll talk about in detail in another video when I discuss my religious background at a later time. Suffice to say, I was forever turned off by the hypocrisy of the church, especially after this incident. I'd been exposed to a number of religious traditions by this time through family demands and found them all to be extremely hypocritical and lacking in biblical integrity. That was my 15-year-old perspective. But the religious overlay, this was his opening to bring in a new control layer, as I see it now in hindsight. It opened the door for a new control layer. And this is what helped him seal the deal he'd been working toward for a couple of years. It was the religious component. He had filled the family gap, and now he was filling the spiritual gap. He could never fill the love gap, however, no matter what he did. And it took many years for that to be made clear. This is when he brought in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Unbeknownst to me at the time, his mother and sister were members and regular attendees of the meetings and Bible studies. I didn't even know what the Jehovah's Witnesses were. I'd never even heard of them or their organization. He began to preach to me their virtues and commitments to the teachings of the Bible as if he'd been attending their meetings. This was a spiritual side to him with depth that I had never seen before. And as I learned the hard way over the years, it was also a manipulative facade for my benefit. Eventually, the rules in the good book, the Bible as some call it, applied to me, but not to him because he was the exception. I was brought into the cult, and let me say here for clarity, I consider all organized religions cults, all of them, regardless of affiliation. Okay, I was brought into the cult. In this case, the cult was Jehovah's Witnesses, and groomed to be the submissive woman whose role it was to follow the lead of the man as head of the family. Like I said, it helped him seal the deal. And remember what I said in part 2 about his drug use. This was secretly going on behind my back throughout all of this. until he blew out his septum sometime in 1975, I think. The drug use continued even after he had left the job at the big yacht yards and was now working a job as a welder for a company making roll bars and push bars for off road vehicles. He worked at this company for a year or two before joining the union and getting a well paying welder's job on the docks in Long Beach, in the Long Beach San Pedro Harbor. I think they call it the LA Harbor now, but I think he was working out of San Pedro. Eventually, we did go out on an official date when I was 15. He took me to my first concert at the Forum in LA. He took me to quite a few concerts, actually. I had to tell my mother I was going to Disneyland with my girlfriends who wouldn't be home until late when he took me to some cow palace in San Bernardino to see Alice Cooper when the Billion Dollar Babies album came out. I saw Neil Young and Linda Ronstadt when she was with the Stone Ponies. I saw Johnny Winter. I saw Edgar Winter, Leon Russell, Jethro Tull, Rolling Stones, to name but a few. I saw many great concerts when they were more like jam sessions and not the Hollywood light show productions they are today. This is when bands could really play and singers could really sing. One of Little Beta's hobbies, and he had several, was playing the guitar. And he became a collector of classic guitars during this time frame. Although I didn't play, my experience was with the piano. He taught me a lot about guitars, amplifiers, and what to look for as he took me around to every pawn shop the state of California had to offer, looking for guitars and parts. He and his friends would get together regularly to jam, as I sat on the couch with others and just enjoyed their practice and performances. I still appreciate a beautiful guitar to this day. Eventually, sex came into play. And with sex and my social grooming and everything else thrown on top, I became pregnant at the age of 16, willingly. This was a mutual thing. He was in no way entrapped, but he was a willing participant who thought this would attach me to him for a lifetime or for as long as it served him. He was planning to be the man in my life as head of the family who had the biblical right to lord it over me as the submissive woman, just like the good rule book said. Except it didn't quite play out as smoothly as I think he envisioned it. His position on the field was not as strong as he thought. I say this now because he has told our oldest daughter in her adulthood that he never wanted her, or either of our daughters for that matter. Why he would even suggest that in his old manhood is beyond me, and I have no words except to say here today that this was not his position when it occurred. What I will also say is that he refused to bond with her after she was born because she took my attention and affection away from him. She took everyone's attention away from him, even his own family's. With her in the picture, he was no longer center stage, and he couldn't seem to share the spotlight in a loving way, even with his own daughter. Today, he would be called a narcissist. So now here we are in early 1975. He is 21 years old and I'm 16. I'm pregnant and it's undeniable. My morning sickness was all consuming for the first 3 or 4 months of the pregnancy. I was still in high school, finishing it up early actually, which I did do, but the morning sickness was making it difficult to function. When I was about 3 months pregnant, my mother became aware of the pregnancy and had an absolute fit, as most mothers probably would, right? That's when things started to get really ugly. And little Beta was starting to panic because my mother hated him and it was unquestionable. And she wanted nothing he had to offer to be born. She had no intention of letting him win anything. and said as much. Her objective was to permanently separate us and end the situation at crisis point. What I didn't know at the time was that my mother had her own little secret that had been swept under the rug in silence for the last 20 years, namely, my brother. And she wasn't about to share it. But she was haunted by it and determined that I would not repeat her past mistakes, mistakes she felt would ruin my life. Although my mother was extremely triggered, she couldn't be truthful. And the truth was, my mother had been neglectful and complicit to this point, which didn't give her as much leverage as she'd hoped, all said. This is not me judging my mother. It's simply the way it was. As an independent 16-year-old made to be responsible for things beyond my age, I didn't feel that she had any room to speak about certain things because she couldn't possibly know what I was feeling or what I was going through, when in fact, she knew very well. But again, she couldn't be truthful. She couldn't be honest because had she told me the truth, her world of secrets would have crumbled with an outcome scary and unknown. Had she been open and honest, some of the multi-generational trauma within her bloodline that I was now reflecting back to her may have resolved itself in a completely different way. But it didn't. The ball was now in my court for resolution, and I didn't have a clue. So she tried to approach it from another direction. And this is where I think I will end part three and continue on with part four next week. Part four will likely be the conclusion of this little saga, or at least this part of the saga, because the saga continues on even still, I'm sad to say. It was never going to go quietly into the good night. Anyway, in conclusion, and for whatever it's worth, this is my little protest against his story. This is me telling my story my way. For the record, it's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I would love to hear your stories as well. So please feel free to share your stories in the comments. Till next time, be well, choose love, and thank you. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.